Once again, a very warm welcome to our Sunday evening service here at KMC. It's good to be back and good to see all of you. And those of you who are joining us online, we welcome you as well. Just to introduce our new sermon series that begins today, Standing on the Promises, from the book of Joshua. We are going to go through a series of sermons and messages from this wonderful book in the Old Testament. And I want to give you a very brief introduction. Later on, Mayuka Pereira will be preaching to us on the very first chapter. Now, the book of Joshua is rightly named because from the very beginning, from verse 1 to the very last chapter, it's all about Joshua. He's the main principal character. So in chapter 1 and verse 1, we have Joshua being this introduction being given to the book. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses said. And then coming right towards the end of the book, we are told after these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua. So the book is named after him. Now Joshua was Moses' assistant, as you know. First mentioned in Exodus chapter 17, when Moses commands him to fight the Amalekites as they travel through the wilderness to the promised land. Now he was a man who was absolutely loyal to God from the beginning as a young person until he comes to the very end of his life at 110. Joshua was one of those leaders that Moses appointed, of the 12 leaders that Moses sent as research assistants to spy out the land and to bring back a report on how the land of Canaan was. And you remember in that story in Numbers 13, 10 of those men said the land is fantastic, everything is great, it's really a land flowing with milk and honey, but it is not a land that we can conquer because there are so many dangers. There are giants in the land, and they are like, they're like giants and we are like grasshoppers, and they discourage the people of Israel. But it was Caleb and Joshua who protested and said, no, even though there are giants, our God is able to lead us into the land, so let us go. But the whole of Israel turned away, and of course they had to wander for 40 years in the wilderness as a result. Now the book of Joshua begins with God's promise. God says, I will give you the land of Canaan. And it ends with the realization of that promise. So if you look at those two verses in Joshua chapter 1, verse 3, and Joshua chapter 23, Joshua chapter 1, verse 3 says, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. A promise from God. But look at what Joshua says at the end. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises that the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. So the book is really talking to us about the promises of God being given at the beginning and being fulfilled at the end. So it's a very hopeful book. God's promises are actually fulfilled within the lifetime of Joshua. And so this book, while it is about the promises of God, you will also know as you read through the book, and I want to encourage you to read through Joshua in the next few weeks, you will notice that the promises of God have to be persevered by faith. Joshua and the Israelites have to do what the Lord has commanded them to do. The promises are there, but they have to be appropriated by faith. That is why our series is called Standing on the Promises of God. We have to stand firmly on the promises of God. So when we look at the overall book, we can see it in 4 sections. The first is from chapter 1 to chapter 5, where you have this word repeatedly told, cross the Jordan, cross the Jordan. Israel has to take that step to cross over into the promised land. But the second big section in chapter 5 verse 13 to chapter 12 is take the land. Israel has to go in now and take possession of the land. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be a walk in the park. Even though God's promises are great, still you have to persevere and struggle and conflict in order to see those promises taken. And then of course the third section is about dividing the land. The land has now been taken. Now it has to be divided among the 12 tribes, 2.5 on one side of the Jordan and the other 9.5 on the other side. And then finally, you have in chapter 22 onwards the 4th section of the book. Now, in the first 3 sections, it's God who initiates. God says cross. God says take. God says divide. But God doesn't say anything in the 4th section. He doesn't initiate it, because now there has to be a response. Joshua initiates and says, now that God has done all these wonderful things as he promised, now we must serve the Lord. Choose you this day who you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And so as we go into 2022, I feel that we are also having the choice of the 12 spies. On the one side, we can say Sri Lanka is a land that God has certainly great potential for, great promises of the kingdom for. But you know what? There are giants in the land. There are the giants of inflation, of corruption, of gas explosions, and the giants of even saltwater crocodiles. And so we are going to look for the best way out. Or we could say, like Caleb and Joshua, yes, there are giants in the land of great difficulty. But in 2022, God has a plan. God has a kingdom commitment to Sri Lanka. And he has called us to live here with a purpose. He will go before us so that we can be a church of blessing for the nation. And he will prosper our prayers. But we must be strong, and we must be courageous, and we must be willing to persevere and trust that with God, all things are possible. We will hear the word today. We will read the scripture. We will sing songs, and we will end on a hymn that says, standing on the promises of God. I pray that your heart, my heart, will be stirred for 2022 to stand on the promises of God. Thank you.